The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see those great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the signs that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Netflix has completely revolutionized the way that we watch shows. Back in my day, you'd have to remember what day and time your favorite show came on. You'd literally run to make it to the bathroom in between commercials. And if you missed an episode, you'd have to wait for up to a year before it was released on DVD to see what you missed. Now, if you've got 12 hours up for grabs, you can sit down with the unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt and watch an entire season in one sitting. And if the show is really dramatic, you can skip ahead to the last episode or just check on BuzzFeed to see how the drama resolves itself, then go back and watch the remainder of the season in peace or in disappointment if your favorite character didn't make it to the end. Today, the disciples are hoping that Jesus will give them a Netflix-esque preview of the end. As they leave the temple where they were sitting last week, they're amazed by the size of the temple complex. "Look at the size of that thing," they exclaim to one another. "Cut the chatter," Jesus says. "When the end comes, there won't be two stones left sitting on top of each other." And in hearing that, the disciples stay completely silent. Later on, though, in private, a few of them go to him and try to get him to fast forward, try to ask, when are those things going to happen? Try to get a sign so that they'll be prepared, so that they will know when the end will come. "Well, just sit on down and let me tell you," Jesus starts. Of course he doesn't say that. That's not Jesus' way to give a simple answer to a very complex question. And so instead of giving them any sort of specific way to tell when the end is coming, he gives them a warning. A warning to be wary of those who would lead them astray. Both astray into complacency so that no matter what happens, they'll be fine at the end. But also to be wary of those who would lead them astray into overconfidence and thinking that this person would be able to predict when the end would arrive. Now, the direct ask for a sign of the end times may not be in our daily prayer list. It may. But Jesus' warning about being wary of the end still holds a lot of meaning for us today. We as a Christian culture love to think about the end. Anytime we see an injustice, we are quick to point out, well, that will no longer happen in the kingdom of heaven. No more racism, no more sexism, no more homophobia. When someone dies, we immediately jump to, well, we'll see them again in heaven. We'll be whole then. And even when something wonderful happens on this earth, we know that feeling will eventually fade. And we console ourselves with, well, that joy that we're experiencing now, that will be multiplied and it will far surpass us once we're in heaven. Isn't thinking about that wonderful? The pain, the joy, the disappointment, the excitement, everything in this life can be overshadowed by that one day mentality. And in the midst of that mindset, I think Jesus would look at us, raise his eyebrows, and say, "Be wary lest you focus too much on the end." So if Jesus' words aren't overly concerned about how we're going to know when those stones start getting torn down off of each other, what's he saying? For that, it's critical that we look back at our gospel from last week, conveniently located in the book of Mark just before this week's story. As a reminder, in that story, Jesus and the disciples were watching people throw money into the temple collection box, and Jesus praises the sacrifice of a widow who put in 2 small coins, all that she had. As Pastor Paul pointed out last week, Jesus' observation was just as much a condemnation of the injustice of the temple officials as it was a commendation of the widow's tithing practices. This temple, the one place where God was supposed to reside, the holiest place in all of Israel, it had become corrupt. It had become a house of injustice. It had fattened the reputations and the pockets of the temple officials, and it had been done on the backs of the poor and the widows. And Jesus has no time for that. By foretelling the destruction of the temple, Jesus is not so much prophesying about some terrible apocalypse in which the literal temple building would come crashing down, but rather Jesus was speaking to an end of systems of injustice. Jesus is saying to his disciples that in that day that will come, sexist institutions like the temple, which took everything that the widow had, the day will come when those institutions will no longer hold power. And in that day, the power will be restored to the ones like the widow, the ones to whom the temple had taken everything. And that's a message of hope. And then, as he often does, Jesus tells the disciples to live fully into that hope. Wars? Rumors of wars, earthquakes, blood moons, House of Cards being canceled. Don't think that these things mean the end is coming, and don't let them stand in the way of your work. Jesus says those things are going to happen. They're as much a part of life on this earth as the labor pains, which I'll never experience, but which signify the beginning of new life. So instead of hailing these things as signs of the end and falling on your knees to await the second coming, Jesus says, stand up. Live in those realities. And in spite of them, be my disciples in the world. Now, if we don't take my advice, and we do skip ahead a little bit to the book of Acts, it is clear the disciples took this message to heart. They would still talk about the end expectantly and excitedly, and they waited for Jesus' return. But even more importantly than that, they did God's work. They began to tear down the figurative stones of injustice so that the temple walls would not be quite so high when Jesus returned. And that's the same message Jesus has for us today. We do know how the story ends, right? In his death and in his resurrection, Jesus gave us certainty that when this season of life on earth ends, we will join him in that resurrection. But that's not where we stop. Even if you are one of those people who just needs to check out something, it's always something little, right, about your favorite character in the last episode. Even if you need to do that, you still go back and watch the rest of the season, right? Don't tell me if you don't. Jesus calls us, just as he called his disciples, to a life that's more concerned with how we embody, how we live the kingdom of heaven than how we wait for it in some distant future. The end will come. But just knowing and accepting that doesn't do much to cast down the temple stones. And as far as we've come, and as much as we'd like to ignore it sometimes, the temple walls of injustice still stand today. In that holy land that Jesus walked, a literal wall exists between Israelis and Palestinians, separating them from their families, from their jobs, and from each other. In our own community, relationships are broken. As often one person's getting ahead in one form or another takes everything that their partner had to give for them. We don't need to wait for the end for these things to be restored. The ultimate resurrection, the ultimate restoration, may need to wait for the second coming. But in hope of that resurrection, we live and we work towards the ends of injustice. So don't be like me, who's in the middle of season 2 of Jessica Jones, knowing one day there will be time for me to finish the season. But I have turned away from that path right now. Focus on God's work in the world. Commit to live in that season of life that God has for us. Because by being God's hands in this world, we heed Jesus' call and we listen when he says, beware, don't be led astray. Because it's hard to be led astray when you are doing God's work, being led by our liberator and by our Savior to pick up that stone and cast it off of the temple.